Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. In this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Anders Petterson, founder of ArtTactic, for a special episode of the podcast, a Mailbag episode. It's always fun doing these. It's great having you participate and also learn what kinds of questions and topics are on your mind. So we solicited questions from you over social media over the past week, and we got some great ones coming in that touched on the current state of the art market, what happens to the art market during a recession, what will the aftermath look like for the NFT boom and bust, and several other topics. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening and for submitting your questions. Anders, thanks so much for joining us. How have you been?
I'm good, Adam. Great to be back again. I can't remember when did we do this last time? Was it February?
Yeah, I think so, or maybe even a little bit earlier than that. Regardless, we're really excited to do this again. It's really fun to see what listeners are thinking about and what questions are on their mind. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the art world and the art market right now, especially given the state of the macro or global economy. So yeah, I'm excited to answer some of these questions.
Definitely. Let's see what we can come up with.
All right. So our first question takes us back a little bit, a few years ago when the pandemic was really beginning. The question is, how well did the art market perform after the first few months of the pandemic, and why did it do so well? So do you want to kick us off with this one? Maybe you have some data even that measures how well the art market actually has done in the past few years since the beginning of the pandemic, and then we can jump into some of the reasons for why we've had such a strong market.
Yeah. I think it was interesting. Obviously, when the pandemic hit us in March 2020, I think obviously it wasn't a shock for, I guess, everyone, but for the art world, I think, as I think we sort of talked about before, but is a marketplace which, or an industry really sort of so dependent on physical events and physical, whether it's auctions or biennials and art fairs. And I think that the initial shock of not being able to do any of these things obviously had a sort of detrimental impact. But I think what was in the first 3 months up till about June, when the auction houses in particular started to experiment with the new formats and hybrid auctions and online auctions, which really, it's remarkable how quickly that transition happened. I mean, I think in the end, this is something that's been lying there latently. It was not that the technology wasn't there. It was just more, I think, a perception maybe within the art market that online is not, it's not a viable channel. And I think when you were forced to use that as the only viable channel, then it worked. And I must say, part of the thing that I think just led to the rise in or how well the actually art market kind of weathered this crisis was down to the art market's sort of agility. On one hand, we talk about the art market as being very traditional and slow at moving things, but I think at the same time, it has this ability to adjust to change. And obviously, this was an unplanned event, but again, it was remarkable how quickly it happened. And I think these changes, which it comes to, the digital innovation or transformation, I think that has, had long-lasting, will have long-lasting impact on the market. I think this has changed the structure of the market. I think it has, brought in, and we can probably come back to some of these things later on, new types of audiences, opportunities for different type of art, new types of artists. It really expanded the art market from an audience point of view, and sort of because it kind of opened up new portals, new gateways for new people to engage. And so I think, and we will benefit from this going forward. I mean, one of the things we have seen over the last 10 years is that there's been a really kind of stagnant growth in the art market. It's not really been in tune and correlated, for example, with how much wealth that's been created in the same period. So, and part of that, I think, is because it's kind of just always tended to engage the same people, maybe people paying higher prices, but not necessarily more audiences. So in order to kind of create a market, I think, there was a need for change, and that change, I think, happened and will continue to go forward. I think it's so I must say, obviously now in a slightly different situation, we can talk about that a bit later. But what's your So from your point of view, what did you see sort of as, being on the ground maybe more than we are?
A few things come to mind. One, just to echo what you said, I really feel like the art market, as you said, usually it lags most other industries in terms of technological innovation. But I do think over the last several years, with the use of Instagram, with auction houses investing in their online platforms, people became more ready, more prepared, more comfortable buying things without seeing them in person, through JPEG. And so I think that's been years in the making, and really pandemic ended up serving as a catalyst where all of a sudden this was their only option in many ways. And people were comfortable enough to do that. I'm curious, I like to think back, if this was 10 years ago, I think we might be in a totally different situation. We would not be prepared, and we would have had a lot less transactions occurring. But fortunately, buyers, collectors are ready to step up. And also just logistically with art shipping and conservators and just technology in general, but just all of these entities that have built up these businesses enabled transactions to occur as well, with people not necessarily being physically all in the same place. And then I guess, the second thing is just, we're so focused on the art market, but during these times I like to take a step back and just look at what's happening in the broader economy and other assets, especially alternative assets. And I think just like art, you saw crypto, you saw real estate, you saw a lot watches, you saw a lot of different assets, alternative assets doing really well during this time period. And I think part of that relates to, central banks just injecting liquidity, lowering interest rates, kind of doing things that they thought they needed to do to make sure economies weren't suffering as much as they were with this pandemic. And I think that those actions created a lot of wealth for the very wealthy and a lot of liquidity, and collectors are mostly sitting at home, not really spending time vacationing and things like that, and just on their phones, on Instagram, looking at art. And I think, I had a lot of conversations with people during that time. They're just at home, looking at art or, potential artists to acquire. And it was just something that, they could really do and stay busy doing that. And so I think even something like that, really also fueled things.
We obviously, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, that we are, heading into potentially a period of uncertainty. I mean, the economic situation around the world isn't great. Inflation is running, close to double digits in many parts of the world, and geopolitical uncertainty, etc. And I know a lot of people are questioning, how will this affect the art market? And I think a little bit, going back to the pandemic, and it was a very different situation, but there is something I think intrinsic in the art world, which makes it, as also from an asset class point of view, behave differently from other asset classes. First of all, I think, at least from part of the art market, there's a certain demographic that's involved in this that, might be less affected by the economic environment that we're finding ourselves in, which often leads to that the art market at least can keep on going for longer than necessarily what the economic situation sort of presents itself as at the moment. But so I think just regards to that, I think, again, there are interesting thing when we look back to, let's say, 2009 and in the financial crisis and the subsequent recession that most countries had after that. Again, how well the art market, it felt the 2009 collapse, obviously, but was virtually back in business again, 12 months after, 12 to 18 months after. And I think whether this is going to happen this year, I think it will, or the coming years will still to be seen. But it is quite interesting to see, first half of this year, 25% up for Sotheby's, Christie's and Phillips in, it's quite difficult situation. It's not like the economic pressures has just come now during the summer. It's been there for some time. And obviously now we're coming maybe to tougher conditions in the autumn. But I still believe that there's some intrinsic strength in this market that make it potentially less sensitive to some of these more kind of economic factors we see out there. Whether that doesn't mean obviously that everything will be okay, but I think there is a good bit of sort of kind of historic precedence, both in terms of COVID and how the art world, in a sense, adapted to that particular crisis, but also then 2009 and how quickly again the market recovered from that economic and actually kind of had a really good run from 210 to about 216. So we'll see. I mean, it's still to be seen whether that economic that economic model still would work in the art world. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, because that's someone submitted a question. They said, I have been only collecting for only a few years. What happens to the art market during a recession? Which is actually a really good question, especially because I think there are a lot of new collectors that have entered the art world in the last 3 or 4 years, and almost everything they bought has gone up in value. This is, normal, and this is all they know. So, and, I see some people starting to look back at auction catalogs now from 2010, 2011, and try like, oh, who's this artist? Who's this artist? I never heard of them, So I think it's on, especially a lot of younger, newer collectors, it's on their mind. So they try to understand what exactly happens when there's a downturn. Of course, the level of the downturn, how severe it is, that will impact things. I think everyone, even the who have been collecting for a few years, they remember when COVID started. I would say that's an extreme case, but at least the feelings I felt was that as the stock market was falling, is that a lot of, in particular, younger artists, speculative artists, some mid-career artists even, felt like, oh wow, I don't know, these were overvalued. We were like, we got our hand caught in the cookie jar. Oops! Like, I can't believe we didn't see this. I can't believe we didn't see what we were living in here. Or these artists, these young artists, they shouldn't be really trading at these prices. What have they really? If you look at their CVs, what have they accomplished? Are they going to be important? I mean, these are the kind of questions and doubts that I think start to enter people's minds, and that's where you can see people all of a sudden deciding not to buy something, and then that can have a domino effect, and all of a sudden an artist maybe who's done really well at auction the last few years, suddenly prices fall a lot. Maybe they get work start buying in, which it feels like nowadays, the idea of, works buying in by a hot artist seems, incomprehensible. All of a sudden people are now examining the quality of each artwork more carefully. All right, is this a good example of the artist's work? Is it just an okay example? People get pickier. All of a sudden, the market's now, I remember also, in 2009, auctions, all of a sudden, you started to see really good results, really only for the really historical, important artists who are already in art history books. Calder, Kusama, just some of the names I remember that is still doing well. I remember, I think it was in 2009, there was in the midst of the recession beginning, there was a really important large Kusama Infinity Net white painting from the 60s, and I remember speaking to a dealer, and they said, I don't care what's going on in the economy, I know this is going to do well, this is probably going to set an artist record, it has to. If it doesn't, then I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to leave this industry, because this is such an important painting, and it did really well still. So I think things can still sell for high prices, but I do think there's all of a sudden a focus on quality, a focus, more scrutinizing eye on artists. I do think we're in someone else asked a question submitted to us, how much speculation has entered the market for younger artists. I think we're seeing a very large amount of supply. If you think about supply and demand, basic economics, we're seeing a strong demand for art and a lot of supply in terms of younger artists. And unfortunately, being an artist is a really difficult job, and it's not, unfortunately, not every artist can have longevity and have strong markets for their entire careers. So I just think you'll see a kind of recycling in a way of certain artists, and that's, if you want to go look back at the auction catalogs from 2009, 2010, 2011, especially for a new collector, you'll see some names trading, for six figures that you probably haven't heard of, or now they trade for $3,000 or $4,000. So unfortunately, some of that will happen. I don't know. I mean, that's I kind of with collectors I speak to, I tell them it's important to collect across generations of artists. It's fun and exciting to collect some younger artists. I think it's important to have mid-career, more established artists as well. I think you can build a nice collection that way that's curated with artists from different generations who maybe influence one another. And I also say, artists who have reached a certain level in their career in terms of, think as an artist and how well they're respected by museum curators and the kind of museum collections they're in. I mean, these artists, regardless of if the economy is doing poorly or doing well, they're going to be around these artists, and they're highly respected, and you can feel pretty comfortable having, a nice investing a lot in those artists in terms of having those artists' works in your collection, because ultimately, they're safe for kind of more blue chip kind of artists. It's the younger ones, more speculative ones that I think people, kind of feel like they're playing musical chairs a little bit now and wondering, when is this going to end? I know this can't last for all of these artists. So that was a lot, but those are some of my thoughts, as I think about these things.
No, exactly. But I think you're right. I think, I guess when I spoke about sort of kind of the strength of the market, I think it's a kind of more, in a sort of broader macro context. But you're absolutely right. And obviously the market is so finally segmented into hundreds, potentially thousands of subsegments. And, one of what you mentioned with young artists, I think, that's obviously a market that's seen, a frenzy and speculation. And you're right. I think, in times of uncertainty, people just becoming more discerning, more careful, and starting to think about, historic value. I mean, you can see, a little bit the recovery of the world market recently. All these things are, it was a soft period between 2016, 2020, and then suddenly these things comes back again. I think, there will, I think we'll see a sort of a gravitation maybe in this period where, the big names and at the higher end of the market, they probably, they will continue to do well. And but as you say, I think the young artists, obviously, there is a lot of historic precedents that, there is not room for hundreds of these artists to sort of enter necessarily the historic canon and become, the worlds of the future. But some will. But I think so I think the speculation aspect is probably one of the aspects that sort of probably will calm down in coming, potentially coming months or years, or depending on, how long this thing will last, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it is, the boom in itself, people can say, well, this is not great for art. But on one hand, it sheds spotlights on, younger talents and creates interest also among young collectors that not necessarily get in on the artists that now are currently doing incredibly well, but there's also this sort of appetite to invest in young artists. And I think there is important, as you say, to kind of collect across generation, and the young artists need support. I mean, they're going to be the artists of the future. So, but I think the expectations, I think this is something many of the new collectors hasn't seen a downturn and do not necessarily know how that will play out. And I think that's probably one of the segments that will be affected, in months to come. So it's going to be very interesting. I think it's not a given that it's going to be sort of, we're going to see, I don't think we'll see a collapse. We did a confidence survey, 2 weeks ago, which shows I would say a significant shift over the last 6 months into more of a pessimistic kind of outlook. Most of that is then, I would say, predominantly driven by the economic fear and the factor regarding that uncertainty. The second thing, I think there's a little bit more uncertainty around the auction side, but I think there's still much stronger. People still felt like the primary market, that still was, they have confidence in that market. So I think it is also a little bit, auction market is also probably more the type of artists that are more in that, more in the sort of value speculative end. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to take their eyes off what's happening, in the broader market as a whole. So when one talks about the market, is often also very easy to get it caught up and maybe lose a little bit on the nuances, but there will always be opportunities, and and the market will shift to where value is. And I think that the question about value will become increasingly important going forward, and value meaning both cultural, historic, and artistic value. So, and that is never a bad thing.
I agree with you completely, and also in terms of a little bit of history between ourselves, I was at the Sotheby's Institute in 2007 and 2008 when we first met, and we saw the economy starting to slow down and the art market was lagging. And one of the reasons why I really enjoyed getting to know you and learning more about and really appreciating what ArtTactic does is because I remember reading one or two quotes from people at the auction houses, galleries saying, oh, the art market is fine. It's different than in the past. It's more global. And so, I always felt, oh, these are kind of I thought maybe there's some truth to these things, but they're pretty self-serving quotes, which is understandable. People in the industry want the market to remain strong. But I remember at that time, the stock market was really falling a lot. And I thought they have to have some anxiety, some fears, but they weren't really wanting to share that. And that's why I really liked ArtTactic and all the data you provide and, the confidence meters and just basically able to get a sense of the real sentiment of people. And because that's difficult to do and to obtain in the art world in a more opaque place. So, and that was really one of the reasons why we launched the podcast, to be able to talk to people for 10 to 15, 20 minutes, to have these lengthier conversations instead of just reading 1 or 2 sentence quotes in an article. So I would say, for, especially for newer collectors, have conversations with other collectors, get a feel for how they're feeling. I think that those kind of things can be helpful. Yeah, if you don't subscribe to ArtTactic, I think it's worth checking out. Just not to self-promote, but I do think, getting that kind of data is pretty unique in the art world.
I think it is general. So I guess from when we met Adam back then, it's I think now also just in general, not only us, but that there is much more information, much more, a level of at least the opportunity to create some more transparency and understanding and educate yourself about the market. I think it's much, much easier to do that now than it was, 12, 13 years ago. So I think it also, not only us, but many others out there, which is also creating an infrastructure of both educational tools and informational tools that is really helpful when you try to navigate, which is, it's a complex marketplace. It's sort of a mix of economics and emotion and sociology and so many different sort of sciences mixed into one, which is often difficult to entangle. And the more you read, the more you listen, the more you talk, the more informed you will become about what to do next. So yeah.
All right. So the next question, it relates to NFTs, about the kind of the boom and the bust of NFTs, and where do things stand now, and what's next for this market?
Well, we started, I think last time we spoke about this on the Mailbag as well. I think if we go back to, earlier this year and last year, when we decided to start to look at this market in, February? Well, actually before that, December 2020. And then we produced our first piece of research in spring 2021. And I was really trying to, I guess my initial curiosity was to try to figure out, what impact is this going to have on the art world. I didn't come from a sort of a crypto perspective. I didn't really try to necessarily understand it from that point of view, but it was more to see the potential that the technology, I guess, and I still believe that is the case. I think it's NFTs as the kind of, maybe as what many people sort of associate with sort of profile pictures like Bored Apes and CryptoPunks, etc. That's one aspect of it. But underlying this, there is a technology that I think is actually, it's going to have a real potential in the art world still. It's going to be now, obviously, there's a sort of a crypto winter, and the wind has sort of kind of gone out of the sail, and speculative aspects of the market is disappearing or has disappeared. There will be strong things that's going to be remaining, that probably will be the kind of generation that will then carry the next cycle. And I think most people sort of, I guess, had this sort of understanding that this can't continue forever. And I think the more people start to question where this value is coming from, it's going to come a point where everyone's going to start to question value, and then suddenly no one has an answer. Then these things tends to kind of deflate quite quickly. But still, I feel now that there is sort of in the NFT world, again, with regards to the art world, is that I think it feels a little bit like the art world is now coming on board after everything else has kind of settled a bit. It's starting to see interesting exhibitions. You start to see interesting artists doing specific projects, and seeing NFTs or the technology potentially as a mechanism or a medium or a platform to do new creative, interesting things. And particularly if you're in a digitally native artist, I think NFT still has enormous potential, but not in the sort of same way as we've seen. It's not all about floor price and how much money you can make out of it, but as a medium to disseminate and to again, for a collective point of view, to provide ownership. So I feel we are in a sort of a period where everyone is probably, counting how much how much is left of what existed, and then hopefully we will build on the stronger part of it. And I don't think, we might call it something else in the future. It might not be called NFTs, but I still think, Web3 and the way things are going, I think that is almost unavoidable. And the art world will have to follow. So I think the good thing that this thing caused and triggered, even if a lot of people were negative to it, is that I think it has engaged the art world to think about technology in a slightly different way in the broader terms. And I think that will, like with the online market that we saw during the pandemic, is actually a good thing, because now people are more in tune to hopefully, at least be part of it and take part in that evolution and maybe dictate what that should look like. So rather than being sitting on, in the back of the car and let someone else take you somewhere, you actually in the driving seat. And I think, the art world can dictate, what do they want this world to look like. And so I think we'll see this sort of sub-worlds of multiple fragmented spaces where art world will carve out their way of using NFTs. The fashion industry will use their bits, and hopefully both different industries can learn from each other. But I do think that the innovation will come back, and the way technology moves in general, I think it will never stop. It doesn't stop. It constantly innovates. So it's good, and I hope that the art world, and not sort of, I guess, just sort of sitting back and say, I knew this was going to happen, and then step back and do nothing, but actually try to figure out how technology in general actually can help them as either as artists or creators, or as the more intermediaries or businesses around it. So I feel we're in a new phase that hopefully will be different, and maybe a little bit like we talked about with the market itself, less frenzied, more discerning, more focusing on the value and the value proposition of what this technology can bring. So that's my thought at the moment. So we'll see. But that's also then, I think now in the next 6 to 12 months, we will start to see also how that world will emerge.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think the technology is really interesting, and I'm really curious to see to what extent it's embraced by the art world and the ways in which artists choose to use it or choose not to use it. But I do think there's a lot of potential there, especially for certain artists. I just think if they are creative and they want to embrace it, there's a lot of exciting things that will come that we can't even foresee right now. I guess when I think about NFTs, I really think about two worlds. One is these NFT artists who are, I feel like, the NFT world and the art world. And to this point, it really seems like they haven't interacted that much, truthfully, outside of the auction houses choosing to sell NFTs. Fine art collectors really didn't, to a large extent, embrace these NFT artists. And maybe to a little bit, these kind of crypto NFT collectors started to collect traditional fine art, but I feel like they were two parallel worlds that were very close to each other, but didn't, integrate with one another. And in terms of the NFT native artists, that all of a sudden a lot of them were, artists that have only been making art for 1 or 2 years. Now they're trading for 6-7 figures. I think it seems like those prices are coming down, but I don't know, if an artist who's been making art for 2 years sells for $30,000 or $40,000, I think that's a pretty good thing. And maybe it settles somewhere around there, and maybe they'll continue to be included, in auction house sales at that level, and maybe they'll have their own sales, and maybe this can continue to be something here. That's a market that has longevity. Just maybe isn't necessarily. I think when we talked about how there's speculation and not all, the art world doesn't have room for all these young artists. Well, the amount of NFT artists well surpasses that. So I think it needs to be curtailed a bit, and it will be. And then you'll end up with a certain number of, pretty reputable artists. I think that should trade for some amount, and maybe some will even be more accepted by galleries and collectors, and, become part of the art world in a way. Yeah. And then I think, in terms of the traditional fine artists, we're starting to see some of them, I think the more entrepreneurial ones, artists who do other kinds of ventures outside of their artwork. Nowadays, certain artists, they really are entrepreneurs. They do clothing deals, they do figures, they do, all sorts of different types of collaborations. I think some of those artists we're seeing create NFTs. Nina Chanel Abney just released NFTs. Damien Hirst has done them. Other artists have. So I'm curious to see if artists in that mold continue to release NFTs and how that goes and who's collecting those. So even if as the market softens, that some good comes from this and the technology is leveraged and we see artists start to use artists are very creative people. We see how they use it and some level it'll become a part of the future. And like you said, I think you can't go backwards with technology. So I think it's going to be here, just a matter of how and to what extent. All right, so this leads to our last question that was submitted that we want to answer today that relates to another new innovative product, fractional ownership. The question is fractional ownership the new collecting model of the future? I'm going to say no. Okay, I'll say this. The fractional ownership, at least to this point, it's really, I think their target has really been people who are not really heavily in the art world. They're targeting people who, to some extent, at least as a product of the economy, have a lot of liquidity, are seeing headlines and, newspapers about, the mega sales at auction, and they don't have exposure to this asset class art, and they want to get a little bit of exposure to it and get some returns. I think, for example, someone I know, a dentist who doesn't collect any art at all, reached out and said, "Hey, Masterworks advertised to me. I'm thinking about investing $50,000. What do you think?" They didn't really, know many of the artists on the platform. They didn't really understand, the mechanisms of how a place like that may acquire the work and how they may sell it. But just really, it was about, to me, it reminded me a lot of, when crypto was really taking off right after the pandemic began. And I remember having conversations with people, said, "I'm just going to throw $20,000 in. Let's see what happens," kind of thing. Not really doing a lot of analysis or studying, just more of like a gamble in a way. And, ultimately, some of these companies have done an incredible job raising a lot of money, getting a lot of investors. A place like Masterworks, they become a huge buyer in the art market, actually, on the secondary markets, because they have all of this capital now to spend. So I think a part of it is a product of what we've seen in the economy. I think it's not, it hasn't proven to really be something that art collectors are really interested in, because you don't live with the art. You don't get any value. I think when you live with art, when you collect art, you get certain value in terms of living with the art. You get value in terms of the relationships with artists, with galleries, going to the art fairs, going to openings. There's a certain cultural value there that enriches your life. And you also, you want to support the artists you collect and have dialogue and engagement. And that's not really what, fractional ownership, at least the way it's set up right now, is about. So I think, I guess I said no, but I think it actually can continue to be a part of the art market. It's just the people doing it, or investing in it for the most part, are not people who are, totally engaged with the art market, or, when we think about collectors. It's definitely an interesting area.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I don't think necessarily that this is a collecting model. I think, as you say, I think it's targeting a different type of audience and for different purpose. I mean, I think this is a financially motivated, vehicle to enter the art market. As you say, I mean, there's little emotional, tangible kind of engagement with the art itself. But going back to the investment side, I think this is maybe not so surprising, but equally surprising that there is, a very large audience out there that seems to have an interest. And I think that this shows a little bit when we talked about earlier regarding, what happened during the pandemic and how little the art world has done to maybe, increase their audience, etc. on many levels. I mean, online, not everyone who bought online would maybe consider themselves collectors either. They may be bought because they want to have something more in terms of decorative sense, etc. But what it did, and I guess the same thing that fractional ownership and these new platforms that are now mushrooming up around the place are addressing a sort of kind of a I guess many are using the kind of phrase democratization of art investment, in a sense that unless you had millions to be able to play in the investable aspect of the art market, you really need to be, have a significant amount of capital and money to spend in order to be able to do that. And, to enter the Warhol market or the Basquiat market or the Richter market or, Liechtenstein, whoever it is, you're not going to do that with $10,000. Well, you might get a print or you might get a, high edition or something, but not necessarily in the sort of the higher end of the investable market. So I think, what these platforms are doing is it's almost kind of, again, giving an audience that and I agree, not necessarily collectors, but people that has read about the art market, had followed what's been said in everything from, Bloomberg to Wall Street Journal about, rises in art and etc. But it felt like, there's no way for them to engage in this. There's no way to enter into it. So I think it has been probably over years, probably over the last 2 decades, a sort of a pent up of people that think, I want to be part of this. How come I can't invest in art? So I think the platform has been successful in tapping into, and I guess it's a little bit of a kind of a pandemia kind of period as well, was where some of these platforms really started to gain traction, was on the back of the pandemic and changes in the way, people were thinking about where to invest money and diversifying away from traditional financial assets and so forth. So I think that sort of phenomenon is really is interesting, but it has to, as I said, if the question was about, is this a new collecting model? I don't think it's a new collecting model. If it was anything, it would be a new investment model in the art. And it is, I would say, purely an investment rather than necessarily something that is something that you can enjoy on a sort of more emotional level. Now, saying that, I do think, different people come into the art market through different doors. Some are born into families that collected, or there are, exposed through their university degrees or just friends, etc. And I guess over time, if this market settles and matures, then there is a chance that, people maybe start initially, engaging through buying a fraction in something, but through that starts to follow and maybe educate themselves and start to think, well, this is really quite interesting now. I start to learn how the art market works. And from there, I feel more confident in entering into the real market. And then maybe that's, and I'm not saying that not every single investor will end up in that, on that sort of trajectory, but I think there might be an opportunity just to create another platform that ultimately engages people in art. I mean, again, from this perspective, only from the investment side, but that could lead to other kind of conversations and interesting things. So I think it's, again, a phenomenon. I mean, I think over the last 2, 3, 4 years, we have seen so many new things happening. And this is just an additional one, which just shows that the art world in general and the art market and the art industry is in a sort of it's in a flux in terms of there is more openness to change. There is more openness, as you mentioned, that Masterworks and some of these platforms are, not maybe from an audience point of view operating outside the art world, but at the same time have to interact with the art world because obviously that's where they're sourcing the work. So they sort of, they are becoming part of this ecosystem that is now the art market, and that's going to be interesting to see in the future. What role will these platforms play in the real market? Because there's in a sense a fractional ownership market, which is almost kind of a derivative market of the real market. And how will these two markets interact with each other? The values that we see in one, how will they correspond with the real values? Will demand that is being expressed through the fractional ownership platform have an impact on the demand we see in the real market? I mean, and this is kind of answers, I think, questions that we don't know answers to. But every time we see a new entry of something, it changes the dynamic of the art market. It changes the dynamic of how we interact with these new type of species that is now entering into this new ecosystem, or to the traditional ecosystem. And that I think is going to be an interesting thing to watch going forward. Is how this will pan out. I mean, there has been this is not new. We started to look at fractional ownership back in 2008, 2009. There was an attempt in Europe to set up a fractional ownership platform. There was a number of them happening in China in around between 2009 and 2011. There's patchy history in terms of track record and how they kind of, how they I guess sustained themselves. Most didn't, But I think, again, like many things, sometimes everything has its time, and it's maybe there is also a bit about where we are in, things has evolved over the last 10 years. We are in a different time now than we were in 2009, and there might be more reception to kind of embrace these kind of models. But I think the jury is still out regarding what the future will be. But again, it's an interesting phenomenon that has really emerged in really in the last 2 or 3 years on the back of the pandemic and a lot of the other changes that we've been seeing.
Well, Anders, thanks so much for coming on the podcast in this special mailbag episode and answering some questions. It was fun chatting with you about a variety of topics. Before we let you go, tell me, what can you share with us? What are a few exciting things we have coming up at ArtTactic?
So basically, we're just now winding down for the summer. We had a hectic sort of June, July with first half results, and we had confidence surveys, and we had a condo report, and we're now kind of preparing for the autumn. So we're really now, I guess, it's looking into first of all trying to kind of publish some reports early on looking at female artists. I think again, just looking back a little bit at we have done sort of in certain reports over the years, covering female in sort of as part of something bigger, but we want to really have a focus on that coming into the autumn, and looking at the sort of the whole genre of female artists, all the way from established all the way to young, and see how that has changed. We know that obviously there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of equality, in particular in the market sense. But I think things are there's much more awareness now today than it was probably 5-6 years ago, and I think that's healthy. So again, there's opportunities I think now also to go. For us, it's really to maybe go just generally a bit behind the sort of the top figures and start to drill down a little bit behind it. So I think next 12 months is really to start to look at the data from a little bit more from different perspective, try to sort of looking at certain very specific segments of the market. I mean, we did a pop art kind of looking at the American versus British pop art, and you see again there's this massive discrepancy between these two markets, even if both artists in both countries in a sense happen to be virtually at the same time. So I think what we want to do a little bit in the light of what you discussed in when I think when things are a little bit tougher, people start to look backwards, and that's a little bit what we want to do going forward. Revisit artists that maybe has had a period in a certain point in time that maybe has lost a little bit of attention and traction, and then maybe sort of start to see what has happened in recent years. And a lot of the data is sometimes even if it doesn't surface to the top, it's sort of there's activity, and it's just that it's not necessarily big enough to kind of come to the surface and get people's attention. So we're going to look at a little bit, rather than focusing all the time on the sort of top artists and top this, we'll go down and into the data and start to look at maybe artists that will emerge, and hopefully will emerge as a result of people focusing more on value going forward.
Great. Well, it all sounds really exciting, and everyone can check out those reports you mentioned that we've done over the last few months, as well as the upcoming ones on arttactic.com. Anders, thanks so much again for joining us. Have a great rest of your summer, and we'll speak with you again soon.
Excellent, Adam. You too. Take care.